Okay, so can we ever hit the 50 billion? And this is based on a book that Matt Hatton and myself published a few months ago. Matt spoke to you on day one of the conference last week and touched on some of these things, and I'm going to pick it up in a bit more detail. So if we go back to 2010, 2011, that's when a huge amount of hype about IoT suddenly materialized. And some of the key proponents here were Cisco and Ericsson, and they were all touting the same vision, more or less, that by 2020, there would be 50 billion connected devices. And you can see some of the graphics from that. Well, we are now in 2020. So how have we done? Well, this is a chart from Matt's company, Transformer Insights. And you'll see there that it estimates that we have about 8.5 billion connected devices at the moment. That's not bad, that's a decent number, but a long, long way off, of course, the 50 billion. And if we break down these devices, they're almost all in the home and in the office, which again is fine, but it's not the kind of thing that we really had in mind when we were talking about the 50 billion devices and many, many things being connected. So what went wrong? Why did we not hit the 50 billion in 2020? And whilst we're on this chart, interestingly, you can see that Matt and his team forecast that even by 2030, we're only going to be at about 24 billion. So, that number's growing and we may well hit the 50 billion, but if you extrapolate that line, it's going to be kind of 2035, 2040 before we get there. So we're still a long, long way off. Well, we picked up on a number of things that we thought went wrong in the process. And of course, Tim and Fernando, Martin and others have also touched on some of these things already this morning. I think the first thing was just the idea that, gosh, everything should be connected and won't everyone want it? Won't it be wonderful? And you can look down that list there and I'm sure you're smiling at some of those concepts. But of course, they were all commercial offerings. They were talked about a lot at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas and others. And analysts and others also, wow, this is fantastic. Look at the size of what we're going to connect. And of course, we don't have any of these at the moment, or hardly any really of any consequence. I think it's worth picking up on a couple of the bullets here. The connected fridge, of course, is a joke that we always talk about now when we talk about connectivity. And I think it's generally been agreed that most users don't really want to be able to see inside their fridge remotely or get it to tell them how many pints of milk that they've drunk or whatever it might be. But there is value for manufacturers in having connected white appliances, fridges, washing machines and others that tells them something about how it's performing. They get some feedback on whether they can make it better, whether they can offer proactive maintenance, that kind of thing. Now, the user doesn't need to know anything at all about that. That could just be a channel from the fridge back to the manufacturer, but a very different kind of industrial connectivity as opposed to personal or home connectivity. The other one worth remembering is the Amazon Dash button. Amazon came out with this concept. It was going to be fabulous. You could have a little button, you could put it by your washing machine and you pushed it and it automatically ordered more washing powder or one by the toilet, it automatically ordered more toilet paper, whatever it was. And of course it went absolutely nowhere because you can do all this much more simply from a smartphone without having to have lots and lots of these customized little buttons all around the place. And it's been discontinued, which of course is another issue because if you did buy lots of these buttons and wanted to use them, then you can no longer do so. Another one worth dwelling on is the fact that often you need to change entire operational practices. So a classic example we talked about a lot was the smart dustbin. And the idea here is pretty straightforward. It knows when it's full or nearly full, and it sends a message to the refuse collection service and they can come along and empty it. And that means that you don't drive around emptying bins that aren't full, and you do go straight to those bins that are full before they overflow. Sounds fantastic. Easy enough to do in terms of a monitor in the bin, and a number of bins came out that could do this. But think about what it means for the refuse collection service. They've got to change everything. They've got to change the way that they run their systems. Instead of just going around in a circle collecting things, they've got to dash out to various places, more like an Uber kind of concept. They need a whole new IoT system. They need staff trained in different ways. They perhaps need lots of smaller, more nimble lorries. The whole thing is a massive change to the way that they run their whole organization. In fact, everything changes more or less. And would you really do that for the sake of being able to get to a few bins a bit more quickly before they overflow? It sounds a little excessive. So the whole concept of understanding the messy real world is something that I think passed by a lot of proponents of IoT systems. And then we've heard a bit about this, particularly from Fernando and others. What do you choose if you want to connect your IoT device? So this for me is a key question. You know, you're making the proverbial cat collar or whatever it might be that's going to be connected. What technology do you put in that cat collar? Do you put in 5G, NB-IoT, LTE, 2G, 3G, LoRa, Sigfox? What are you going to put in there? Wi-Fi, Bluetooth? And you might well stand back and say, I don't know, I can't put them all in. That's vastly too expensive. If I get the wrong one and it gets turned off, if I put in NB-IoT and the operator for that country, as Docomo did in Japan, decides to turn off NB-IoT, then I've got a whole load of stranded cat collars that no longer work. What do I do? And until you're absolutely sure of one single connectivity solution that's going to be there for the life of your device, which might be 10 years, it's a really risky proposition to move ahead. And that's a big question mark around IoT that still exists. We really do need to narrow down on fewer solutions. And Fernando talked about NB-IoT being shut down so an operator could rationalize its service. Yes, I agree, that's probably why it's done. But does that mean we should ignore NB-IoT in the future? Because every operator is going to do that. And we should in fact move back to LTE-M or something different, or not. You know, and that doubt in the marketplace is a really big issue for people who are designing and trying to adopt different solutions. Okay, a few other ones to whiz through quickly. In security, we've already heard a lot this morning about security. Don't say too much on that, other than, of course, it does prey on the minds of people who might adopt things. Immature markets, so markets that apply the old way of working, the old way of collecting dustbins rather than the new way. A particular one I think it's important to dwell on, that the proof of concept, POC, proof of concept, where companies are very happy to trial something. You know, yes, sure, we'll take your systems, we'll put it into 6 dustbins or whatever it is. We'll give it a go, see if it connects. Oh yes, look, it does, great. That's interesting, it connects. Oh, and we get a message back. But then how do you turn that into something real, some commercial focus? And if this proof of concept has been picked up and run by some kind of technology or IT department, it can be very difficult to inject it into the main business, which wants to understand, of course, how it's going to make profit from this. And I think, you know, this has been a key issue. We have seen so many proof of concepts. I know of nearly 200 smart city trials, but no actual smart cities. We really have got stuck in this. And then the final point is the value chain. And I think we've already talked a bit about this before, but all the suppliers, particularly at the lower levels of the value chain, they're supplying connectivity, supplying chipsets, modules, they all want to move up the value chain because that sounds good. Sounds pejorative to be at the bottom of the value chain. Being at the top sounds like the place to be. And all this movement around the value chain into areas where people don't really have expertise is not helping. It's just confusing the picture, with people like operators jumping into areas which are actually best left for companies who are systems integrators or have more skills in that space. What about what might go wrong in the future? Well, I think the first thing that I can see being a problem is the assumption that AI is going to be the solution for all the IoT problems. There's going to be billions of connected devices, the story runs, they'll generate lots of data that will feed through to wondrous insights. I buy that, but we haven't got billions of connected devices yet, at least not outdoors where they're generating useful data. And until we have, we can't get the data onto which the AI engines will run to generate useful outcomes. So yeah, AI is great. It will make IoT better. I think it will deliver all sorts of interesting insights, but only when IoT is really well established and successful. AI is the icing on the cake. Once we've made the cake, it's not the cake itself. And I'm much less positive about 5G than some of the previous speakers. So 5G claimed it was going to have massive machine connectivity. It has nothing of the sort. There is no standard in 5G to do massive machine connectivity, by which I mean millions and millions of devices. Instead, it's just saying, oh, we'll take NB-IoT, we'll call that 5G, and we may enhance it over time. And there's vague talk in release 17 about perhaps something that sits in between NB-IoT and full broadband solutions. But there's nothing that does this massive machine connectivity at all, despite the fact that 5G proponents and many others still claim that 5G is going to be the revolution for IoT because of this connectivity. It doesn't exist. Of course, 5G does have the ultra low latency, ultra reliable element, but my take is that this is a very niche role. I would imagine this is less than 1% of the 50 billion connected devices, maybe even less than 0.1%. Martin's rightly talked about industrial IoT, and that's really interesting. But how many factories are there in the UK, for example, that might adopt it? I suspect of the order of 100 or so. It's not a large volume, although for the factories that want it, it could be very useful. Cars, we talked about a bit. Yes, cars should be connected, often are, but they don't need 5G. They need some kind of telemetry, low data rate. And this whole sort of autonomous cars needing 5G, I think is a very fallacious argument. Autonomous cars are autonomous. Would you buy a car that had to have connectivity in order to go anywhere? If you did, then you'd get it about a mile from the dealership and it would probably stop because it didn't have any connectivity in that tunnel and you'd never get it out again. So clearly that can't happen. So I think actually 5G is unhelpful because it's just throwing in more potential solutions into the mix when we need to narrow them down. So assuming 5G is going to benefit IoT, I think is wrong. It'll, in the end, we'll work it through, but not for the moment. Okay, so that was lots of things that went wrong. How can we get some things right? We've heard quite a few good suggestions already from the speakers this morning in terms of how to deliver complete solutions. I think that's really important. Pick a segment, something quite specific, where there's clear benefit from IoT, ideally in some way that just has a very simple, straightforward productivity improvement business case. It doesn't rely on any wonderful new service. Simply adopting IoT means you can do what you do today better, more efficiently, more cheaply. And then, as we've heard, make sure you can get a complete solution. And that will often come from a wide range of companies. So make sure that that range of companies is assembled within a large consortium and can deliver on that with somebody who can orchestrate that complete solution. Don't try and be all those parts. Don't move around the value chain. Pull together that solution. And make sure that everyone in the value chain can make enough profitability. So for example, if you look at NB-IoT provision, we're seeing NB-IoT SIM cards that only cost 10 euros for 10 years worth of connectivity. So that's €1 a year. That's almost nothing. And why would a mobile operator be interested at that kind of price level? So the value chain needs to be rejigged a bit to make sure that everyone can make enough for it to be interesting to them, because if they don't play in the value chain, then the whole system will fall apart. And then absolutely to Martin's point, it's going to take a long time. The people who adopt IoT solutions typically move slowly. They have, as Martin rightly said, long cycles. They will often require all sorts of proofs and developments and so on in their industry before they adopt. And hence the reason why those charts early on in my presentation showed relatively slow growth. That might all sound somewhat negative, but both Matt and I are huge believers in IoT. Both of us have started up companies in this space. We both still continue to work in this space. We think it is critically important to an aging population, to a world with climate change, with growing congestion, and to a question earlier, in helping resolve some of the issues happening around COVID and some of the outcomes and changes in behaviors that we'll see as a result. So IoT is absolutely fundamentally valuable and needed to move ahead for all of us. And 50 billion is not an outrageous number. It's just going to take a lot longer time to get there than we originally expected. And that requires learning lots of lessons. We hope that people will listen and learn. It doesn't always happen. And the evidence around some of the 5G hype suggests that there's still a lot of learning to do. But sooner or later, I think we will get there. With that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions.
William, really interesting presentation. I do like people who just cuts the heart of things. So it's interesting what you're talking about with 5G and massive IoT. in the first half of this conference, which was last week, and by the way, both halves will be online shortly. We had Ardash from ABI Research talking about the role of low power WAN for massive IoT, which seems more sensible from what you've been saying than looking to 5G. I also got really bored a long time ago with autonomous cars being wheeled out as the kind of poster child, or whatever you want to say, for 5G because of the low latency. So you said there will be autonomous cars, but not using 5G or the model that we've been imagining. I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on that. How are we going to have an autonomous car that works in a tunnel?
Sure. So, I mean, there are autonomous cars right now. You know, Google and Tesla and others have been trialing them in California for years. They've notched up millions of miles of driving, with a few accidents and so on and so forth. They're not perfect yet, but they're not something that doesn't exist. And they've been doing that absolutely fine without 5G, because they've been pretty much autonomous. They've been driving around, processing everything they need to within the car, and just sending occasional information backwards and forwards to the network to discover whether there's a traffic jam or that kind of thing. And that's really the model for autonomous cars going forwards. We'll see an increasing number of features built up. Already you can buy cars that will maintain lanes on the motorway and maintain distance without any trouble. That's a degree of autonomy. I think it'll take us 10 to 20 years before we really see a significant number of truly autonomous cars driving around. And they will connect whenever they can and get all sorts of information about what's going on, but they will not be controlled by some centralized computer sat, wherever in GCHQ or wherever it might be, trying to manage every single car on the whole of the UK road network to within an inch of its life. They'll all be autonomous, doing their own thing, and occasionally talking to each other and other people. And we don't need 5G for that activity.
Okay, and I've just got one other observation to make, and it'd be interesting, William, to see what you think, because clearly you set a lot of store by AI. AI makes me really jumpy, not because I think machines are going to take over the world, actually quite the reverse, but because human beings design AI, and human beings tend to make rather a mess of things, in fact, as we've discussed. And I just am a bit concerned about AI's potential to amplify and worsen the situation rather than improve things, because we carry on doing what we did. We're just, the way we deploy things using AI is just kind of a reflection of our current thinking. One good example is the design of medicine, which ignores half the population of the world because women have to immunity systems, but that's never taken into consideration in medicine design. And I can see if that carries on with AI, do you see what I mean? It'll just make the problem a lot worse. And I just feel like in IoT, there's a lot of potential for that too. Well, in any use of AI. Yeah,
no, I mean, you're absolutely right. We should be very cautious about systems that effectively we almost by definition don't understand fully ourselves. My take is you might find it very useful. Let's say, for example, the connected cow. It's a classic example at the moment of IoT. It's not a bad one, actually. It makes a lot of sense because cows are worth a lot of money. And if you had a system that actually looked across the whole country and said, what's best practice? Who seems to be getting the most milk yield or whatever it might be from their cows, and why? And it's essentially a system that sort of trawled vast amounts of data to look for various correlations that humans just would take too long to search for. And it finally came back and said, actually, interestingly, if you do X, Y, and Z, then that seems to deliver better productivity across the whole of the agricultural system. That's the kind of thing I think AI could do. But you're right, you're quite right. If we start getting into human behavioral elements, then that's dangerous, both because it might have built-in prejudices and biases, and also dangerous because we might change our behavior as a result, and the AI system might take time to catch up upon that. So we do need to be cautious.
It's a bit of a case of who guards the gods, really, I think. Anyway, Thank you very much, William, for a great presentation.